Right before we jump into this video, if you haven't signed up for the Froknows Photo email list, just look for this orange box over on the website, put your name, email address in it, hit send it, and I'll send you a free guide to capturing motion in low light situations. Jared Polin, FroknowsPhoto.com, and this is a side-by-side comparison of the Sony A9, Nikon D5, and the Canon 1DX Mark II. Standing in for the 1DX Mark II is the original 1DX because that's all I could get my hands on. Now I'm going to go over the specs and tell you what I think and which camera I think gets the check mark based on the specs as well as based on my real-world usage of all three of these cameras. Down below you can click a link to check out all three of the real-world reviews that I've done for each one of these cameras. So know that I've used each one of these cameras in a real world situation, but here I want to go over the specs, tell you which ones win, and let's get into the specs right now. So let's look at the image sensors in each of these cameras. The Sony has a 24.2 megapixel full frame sensor, the Nikon a 20.8 megapixel full frame sensor, and the Canon lagging way behind with a 20.2 megapixel full frame CMOS sensor. Now, are you going to see much of a difference between each one of these sensors and their megapixels? The truth of the matter is not really so much because there's other things involved like ISO and the processors, and we're going to talk about that as we move forward. So I'm not going to give the advantage to anybody in this one. Just know that the Sony is the newest of the three models, so maybe it has a slight edge in some things. Plus, Sony makes a lot of sensors for Nikon, so keep that in mind. So let's talk about the image processors inside this camera. The Sony has what's called a Bionz X image processor. Nikon has an Expeed 5 image processor, and the Canon a dual Digic 6 Plus image processor. So in this case, I'm always going to lean towards the camera that has dual processors in it. That means it has more horsepower to process the images and the files that are running through it. And in this case, I'm going to give a check mark in terms of processors to the Canon. Now, one of the specs in the higher end cameras that is most important to me is high ISO capability. So let's look at the ISO ranges of these cameras. So the Sony is going to give you 100 to 51,200, expandable all the way up to 204,800, though I wouldn't be shooting up there with any camera. The Nikon gives you 100 to 102,400 natively, which is a really nice range, expandable all the way up to 3.28 million. Yes, million with an M. Now the Canon, on the other hand, does 100 to 51,200 and is only expandable up to 409,600, which is better than what the Sony offers. But in all reality, you are not going past, in my opinion, 20,000 sometimes. If you're going past 20,000, you are almost shooting in the dark. Now, some people may find a use for that, but I'll say I personally own the D5 and rarely go past 20,000, and I did a picture at 20,000 at a concert backstage, and it did turn out, but I'm not sure that I would push it much further than that. In my experience using each of these cameras, I still think Nikon has better high ISO capability than any of the other cameras. The Sony, being the new kid on the block, does a very good job, and the Canon also does a very good job. I don't think you're going to go wrong with either one of the cameras in this case, but with the Nikon having the better native ISO right off the bat, I'm giving the check mark to the Nikon D5. Now, these top-of-the-line cameras are known for how many frames a second they can shoot. These are meant to be sports cameras in a lot of situations, especially on the Nikon and Canon sides, but how many frames a second can you shoot? Well, let's start with the Sony. The Sony can do 12 frames a second in uncompressed, but it can do 20 frames per second in raw compressed. The Nikon can do 12 frames a second, and the Canon can do 14 frames a second and all the way up to 16 frames a second with live view, though you're not really going to jump into that situation very often. Now, the Sony shoots 20 frames per second, which means I give that the edge if you need to really get a lot of frames per second because it shoots so many. Now, keep in mind, the more frames you shoot, the more you have to edit, and if you're shooting raw, it's going to take up a lot more space on your computer. So when I shot with the Sony A9, I personally knocked it down to 12 frames per second, and it's still mighty fast. The one thing I didn't mention is that that's with an electronic electronic shutter. If you want to shoot with the mechanical shutter, which you're probably not going to do, is 5 frames per second in this camera. So in terms of mechanical shutters, the Nikon and Canon are going to be better for getting frames per second there, but the Sony kicks the asses of these two at shooting 20 frames per second when you want to shoot in the electronic shutter mode. So can I give Sony the check mark? All right, I'll give Sony the check mark. Now, what's important when you're taking photos? Focus. Now, how is the continuous autofocus in all of these cameras? They're all very good, but let's look at how many focusing points you have. You have 693 focus points in the Sony A9. They cover almost the entire frame, so if you need to get a focus point near the edge of the frame, you're getting it. On the Nikon, you have 153 autofocus points, with 99 of them being cross types. Now that spreads pretty far out, but not nearly as far as what the Sony offers. And then the Canon, all the way over here, has 61 autofocus points, with 41 of them being cross type. Now, it doesn't have as many as the Nikon or the Sony, but in my experience, it does a fantastic job with autofocus. The Nikon does a fantastic job with autofocus. The Sony also does a fantastic job, but in this case, having 693 autofocusing points that stretch all the way out to the end gives the check mark to Sony when it comes to focus points. Now, in terms of critical focus, you have to look at that too, because these are two different types of systems. This is a mirrorless camera. These two obviously have mirrors because they're DSLRs, so in terms of absolute critical focus, I give the check marks to the Nikon and the Canon, but when it comes to just shooting with the new mirrorless technology, this thing is pretty darn good, so check mark to that with the amount of focusing points, and it does a great job. Now let's look at the maximum shutter speed. With the Sony, you can do 1/32,000th of a second with the electronic shutter and 8,000th of a second with the mechanical shutter. With the Nikon, up to 1/8,000th. With the Canon, up to 1/8,000th. That really hasn't been a major deal breaker for me in the past to go much past that. But what I can say is having the ability to shoot at 1/32,000th of a second may come in handy when you're getting all creative out there. So the Sony is getting the check mark for shutter speed. Let's look at burst rate, because these are action style type cameras. The Sony is going to give you 241 frames in a row in RAW format. The Nikon, 200 frames in RAW, and then the Canon is giving you 170 in RAW. Now, when I'm shooting uncompressed RAW, you don't get as many files as what I just said, but in most situations, I've never outrun the buffer of either of these cameras, so nobody gets a check mark. Now, speaking of how many frames per second can you get, what are the memory cards that you will find in these cameras? Now, they all have dual card slots, but only one of them uses the same card in both slots. The Sony A9 has one UHS 2 card slot for SD cards, and then it has a regular SD card slot. The Nikon D5 has 2 different options that you can purchase, the one with dual XQD or one with dual compact flash. Personally, I would go with the XQD card, so if you're out there looking for the D5, do not buy the compact flash. I will plan a stake in that one. And then the Canon has 2 cards. It has a CFast card, which is expensive, but super fast, and it also gives you the option to have a compact flash card in there. In my opinion, the Nikon wins here because it has the same card format in both slots. If the Canon went ahead and did that and put 2 CFast cards in there, I would have given it a bonus check mark. But I know the Sony has 2 SD card slots, but in my opinion, in a full-on professional camera, I want to have a higher-end, faster professional card, and in this case, the Nikon offers that. Now, I know why Sony went ahead and put SD cards into this camera. Even though they're the ones who invented the XQD card, they did it for size purposes. But as a professional, put the faster, better cards in this camera, and you would get the check mark. But in this case, the Nikon wins. Let me jump in here real quick and say, just because we're talking about gear, how do you input and organize your gear? Well, I created an app called My Gear Vault. It's the best way to input, organize, and protect your gear, and it's absolutely free. You can download it right now at mygearvault.com for iOS and Android. Now let's get back to the specs. So being that a lot more people are interested in video these days, how do these cameras act when it comes to shooting video? The Sony right here can do full frame 4K UHD downsampled from 6K at up to 30 frames a second. It also offers 1080p at 120 frames per second. So that is pretty good. The Nikon, on the other hand, offers a 1.5x crop factor with UHD 4K video recording at 30 frames per second. So that means any lens that you put on this camera when you're shooting 4K video will be multiplied by 1.5, whereas with the Sony, a full frame lens is going to give you the same full frame equivalent millimeters. And finally, the Canon is a 1.4x crop factor with DCI 4K video recording at up to 60 frames per second. It will also do 1080 at 120 frames per second. Now the same thing applies here. Any lens that you put on this camera will be multiplied by 1.4 times when it comes to that 4K recording, but keep in mind you can record up to 60 frames per second. Now this is a tough one to decide which one does it better, because the Canon does have a very nice bit rate when you are saving that video file. Now on the other hand, the Sony can shoot 4K full frame. That is a big deal, but also the fact that it's downsampled from 6K is really awesome that it offers that. So in this case, I think I have to give a check mark to the Sony. Now, which one of these cameras is best when it comes to autofocus as it pertains to video? Now, the Sony does offer full-time autofocus when it comes to video that is pretty good. Now, the Nikon, on the other hand, does have the capability of doing autofocus for video. It's just not very good, and it should be thrown off this table, but I'm not gonna throw it off because it's mine. And finally, the Canon has what's called dual pixel AF, which kicks ass, and I think it beats all of the other cameras on the market today. So if you're looking for a camera that's going to do the best autofocus when it comes to video, the Canon is doing a great job. The Sony isn't far behind, and the Nikon was left way back in the distance because it's not very good when it comes to autofocus for video. Quickly, let's look at which cameras have Wi-Fi and NFC built in, and there's only one up here that has it built in, and that's the Sony. You have to buy additions to the Nikon and the Canon in order to shoot with Wi-Fi. Each one of these cameras offers you 100% viewfinder coverage, which means what you see through the viewfinder in terms of the framing is what you're gonna get when the image is taken. Now on the Sony side, you have a 3.7 million pixel electronic viewfinder, or what they call as an EVF. That thing is incredible. Now where the Sony wins is the fact that when you're taking pictures, there is zero viewfinder blackout. Now the Nikon and Canon, as you're shooting 12 frames or 14 frames a second, you are going to see a little bit of blackout when you're shooting, which may interfere with your ability to track the subject. Now it's not terribly too bad because these are the top of the line cameras, but if you are looking for zero blackout whatsoever, the Sony is gonna win. So what kind of body features will you find on this camera? Now they all have extra function buttons and they all have joysticks, but the Nikon and the Canon have built in a vertical grip. They have it built in, but on the Sony, if you want to get a vertical grip, it's going to cost you an extra $350. Now that leads us into battery power. The Sony has the smallest battery of all of these cameras. Obviously, look at it, it's petite and dainty, so it's not going to last as long as the Nikon. Nikon's batteries, I think, are some of the best batteries that you will find in a large DSLR. They seem to last forever, especially when you're shooting video, which is great that it doesn't chew through them. So the Canon has a very similar battery to what you would find in the Nikon, so that one does just as well. But at the end of the day, if you're gonna look at the Sony, you better be buying a grip so that you could have the extra stability, the extra power, because those batteries don't last as long. This case, Nikon's getting the check mark because I think their battery lasts longer when you're shooting video. Now let's talk about the screens you will find on these cameras. The Sony has a 3-inch screen, but it is tiltable. It also has a touchscreen, though it's not very good for touch because there's not many features that are active that allow you to use the touchscreen. It also only has 1.4 million dots. Now the Nikon has a 3.2-inch touchscreen that gives you 2.36 million dots and is an awesome screen because you find it on a lot of higher-end Nikon cameras like the D500, the D850, as well as this D5. That screen is great, but when it comes to the touch functions, there's not as many touch functions as I would like to see because they didn't make it as touchable as the D850. Now moving down to the Canon, you have a 3.2-inch touchscreen with 1.62 million dots. Same things apply, not as many touchable features as I would like to see in a high-end camera. A lot of people think that pros don't want the ability to touch the back of the screen. I want the touchability of the screen because there's a lot of functions that are just much easier when you can touch them. Now, in terms of which ones are the best here, the Sony one, not very good when you're outside, and it's not a very clean or clear screen, though you do have that EVF that is extremely bright and beautiful. If you want to review your pictures, you can put your eye up to the camera and go ahead and do that. The Nikon, awesome in all lighting situations, absolutely love that. And the Canon, it's okay. I just found that in bright daylight, I needed to use a loupe in order to see the screen the way that I wanted it. And that means the Nikon gets the check mark this time. Another feature that I didn't want to forget to talk about were illuminated buttons. The Nikon gives you the ability to turn on illuminated back buttons, which means if you're in a dark situation, you can see what the buttons are, whereas on the Sony and the Canon, you cannot. So check mark to Nikon. Now let's look at the weights. The Sony clocks in at 1.48 pounds, which is awfully dainty. The Nikon 3.11 pounds, and the Canon 3.36 pounds. So the Canon obviously is a little heavier than all of them, and the Sony is the daintiest of the daintiest, which means it's going to get the check mark in terms of weight and size because it's nice and small, but that doesn't mean that it's the best camera for being out in real-world situations. The reason I say that is that the Nikon and Canon are built extremely rugged. They are weather-sealed. They are meant to be used in extreme situations where I don't think the Sony is going to be able to hold up in a lot of extreme situations. And finally, we have the price. The Sony clocks in at $44.98, the Nikon at $64.96, $96.95, and the Canon at $59.99. So obviously right there you can see that the Nikon is the most expensive by a couple $100. The Sony, you have to remember that if you want to get the vertical grip, you're going to have to spend another $350 to do that. I can't give a check mark to any of them because that all depends on what you're looking for as a photographer to determine which camera is right for you in that situation. And now my final thoughts. This is where I tell you which camera I think is the best and which one you should buy. So we'll start with the Nikon in the middle. If you already have Nikon glass, you're most likely going to stick with Nikon and go with the D5. Same thing applies with the Canon. But there's a lot more people today that shoot Nikon and Canon that are looking to jump to the A9. I've heard a lot of sports photographers have started to switch over to the A9. Now, if you're looking for a camera that's smaller, that's lighter, that you can get around much easier, then obviously the Sony's going to win because it's super dainty. But if you're looking for the biggest selection of glass, the Nikon and the Canon have a larger selection of glass. Sony doesn't have as many professional high-end lenses as of right now. They are starting to add them from time to time. Now, if you need to shoot in complete silence, there's only one winner here, and that would be the Sony. If you need to shoot in silent, that's going to do the best job. The Nikon and Canon, they sound like tanks when you're shooting those photos, especially when you're shooting 12 and 14 frames a second. You can do 20 frames a second silent with this Sony, which makes that a winner if you need to shoot in a much quieter situation. When it comes to autofocus, we've already talked about those different specs. At the end of the day, I can't give a check mark to say which one is the best one here because each one's going to serve a purpose in its particular situation. The Nikon and Canon, that's a complete toss-up depending on which side of the coin you're on. There's pros and cons to both. The Sony has come a long way and is almost there as the camera that could take over the world. I did say that. It's really darn close. It does a fantastic job. It needs more glass. It needs to be more rugged. It needs to be a little larger. But that's really it, guys. Like I said earlier, I have real-world reviews of each of these cameras so you can see how they worked in the real world. You can download their RAW files to see which one's the best for you. But this was a side-by-side comparison based on the specs to tell you which ones I think win in each category. And at the end of the day, it's going to come down to you to decide which one is the right choice for what you're shooting. And there you have it. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give this a like, and give your opinion down below in the comments. If you're watching on Facebook, go ahead and like, share, and comment. Those shares are really important, so definitely do that. And one more time, if you haven't signed up for the Froknows Photo email list, just look for this orange box over on the website, put your name, email address in it, hit send it, and I will send you a free guide to capturing motion in low light situations. Now go ahead and click on the screen to check out any of those real world reviews, and that's where I'll leave it. Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.